One of the greatest innovations in human history occurred on a Thursday afternoon. It was oddly chilly that day and had been all week. Doctors Michael Foster and Nicole French had returned from lunch while allowing their latest model to run its code. The two were, as they would eagerly tell nearly anyone they came across, just on the cusp of finally creating a truly self-aware artificial intelligence. The pair were leading researchers in their fields and had been working on a very generous grant from a rather eccentric futurist billionaire who, like them, fully believed that with the advent of AI, humanity would be catapulted into a new age of prosperity and discovery. As they hurried back to the lab, almost speed-walking along the concrete walkways that carved through the lush green campus, the recurring, exciting, and usually incorrect certainty that this time their efforts would bear real fruit coursed through them. Dr. Foster, nearing the front door, took a comically long step forward, reaching the door before his colleague and opening it. He stepped aside, ushering her in with an exaggerated swing of his arm. The pair chuckled excitedly as they rushed in and down the stairwell to the left. Sweeping into their lab, they found their lab assistant, Charlie, sat staring into his phone, his head bobbing slightly. He didn't move, as if he hadn't heard their return. It was as if whatever he was staring at had his full and undivided attention. Stepping around from behind him, Dr. Foster tapped him on the shoulder, causing him to jump, startled a bit in his seat. The jostling motion caused an earbud to fall from his ear. Though it was not anything work or research related, Foster smiled, noting quickly that his fantasy football picks, a hobby Charlie had actually gotten him into some weeks ago, were all doing quite well. The day, he thought, was a perfectly fine day indeed.
Charlie,
he said as his assistant reached down to retrieve his earbud.
Has the model completed its checks?
Charlie awkwardly turned and rose from his chair.
Sorry, Dr. Foster, I got distracted,
he replied, shuffling over to another workstation.
Not a problem, Charlie. Nice to see my Bucks picks worked out.
You know, I bet Roy would prefer we all could spend as much time on him as you two do on those games.
Dr. French teased.
You still want to name him Roy. How do we even know it'll be a him, or her, or that it'll even like the name Roy?
Foster bantered back.
I bet he won't like football.
Dr. Foster and Charlie shot each other baffled looks.
For one thing, only minds devoid of a sense of joy don't like football. Isn't that right, Charlie?
Said Foster. Charlie simply now shot both of his boss's confused expressions. The pair laughed.
Don't worry, Charlie.
Dr. French began.
We're just having a laugh, and besides,
she continued, shooting a sarcastic sideways glance at her colleague.
I could just add a few lines of code and
deny our dear Roy the dignity of deciding for himself? How dare you, madam?
Foster hollered, cutting her off mid-sentence with a laugh.
So, okay then, it's decided. Roy it is.
A moment after their workplace chuckle subsided, the display on a terminal which had been running the numbers and performing all manner of simulations, attempting to test the design and coding of their latest AI design, came to life. The countless lines of running characters and numbers stopped, with a line of blinking text at the bottom. The text read simply, Model test function performed. Code and function coherence 100%. The room fell absolutely silent. The two researchers' eyes widened with excitement as they looked first at the terminal display, then to each other, and then back again. They had done it. After nearly a decade of theory, experiment, and failure, Doctors Foster and French had successfully modeled and coded a fully self-aware and sentient intelligence. It was the breakthrough they had been dreaming of, and at last, there it was. The silence persisted for several more moments. The three were each positively swimming in shock and excitement. Finally, It was Charlie who broke it when, in a soft tone, he asked,
Dr. French? Dr. Foster? Should we maybe start it up and, well, say hi?
The researchers shot one another one more glance, this time with both of their faces splitting into broad grins. Rushing to their respective terminals, Dr. French first booted up the quantum computer they had fought arduously at the beginning to obtain for their research, and which, as they were so often reminded, cost untold millions of dollars. The machine came alive in the next room over, and the curious clinking and odd whooshing sounds it made as it did so soon could be heard throughout the lab. Charlie had, over the countless times he'd heard the computer operate, always thought it sounded just a little like the jingling of Christmas bells. On this occasion, between the sound and excitement of the breakthrough, despite it being the middle of May, it felt very much like Christmas all the same. At his station, Dr. Foster began recompiling the necessary codes, commands, and network connections in preparation to wake up their new creation. Over the years, safeguards and fail-safes had been crafted in preparation of this moment. Worries of some hyper-intelligence escaping the confines of its lab and mercilessly taking over the world like a science fiction horror story had been a perpetual criticism and concern of many a colleague, friend, and even family member since first Foster had first begun his work. French endured the same as she became dedicated to the point of obsessed with the pursuit in her own right. It hadn't been until the two knocked their heads together and made real progress that anyone began to really worry. Fears of either a murderous or cruel superintelligence taking over military systems, crashing planes, shutting off access to water and medical care, and replacing mankind, a la the Terminator, were common refrains from their critics. The university the pair worked at was also host to a large and well-respected school of theology, and many a religious scholar and academic had made a point to warn the researchers that playing God in such a way was sure to lead to ruin. In addition to those who were simply wary or afraid of the concept of AI, a fair contingent of their critics simply expressed that they felt the endeavors were impossible and, frankly, a gross waste of time and resources. However, now, just moments away from what he was sure would be a ground-shaking moment in human history, Foster smiled and paused a moment, considering the best way to balance smugness and magnanimity when revealing his success to the world. Loading the executable file, which would, when opened, spawn the necessary lines of code, creating an algorithmic process that would build the artificial neural network, Foster gave a look to French.
Ready on your end?
He asked.
Intranet containment is locked. Temperature is just right. Ready on my end.
She replied. Among the many concerns and precautions the team held and had taken, isolating was considered the most crucial, as it was commonly recognized that once a fully formed AI could access exterior networks and find its way to the internet, any number of unforeseen consequences could arise, with many of them possibly spelling the end of mankind as a whole. No one was taking any chances.
Charlie?
Foster asked over his shoulder.
Power's good, boss. All set.
Charlie replied, checking his numbers one more time.
Okay then, folks. Here we go.
Foster took a deep breath and then, in what felt somewhat anticlimactic, pressed the Enter key and watched as the scrolling lines of code populated his screen.
Looks to be running perfectly. In a few moments, we should have a Roy to say hi to.
French said, monitoring her own datasets, eyes wide with excitement. A few moments passed. The jingling and clinking and whooshing and humming of the large quantum computer in the room adjacent to their primary lab space grew louder. Perhaps 30 seconds later then, the lights in the lab shut off, and all but the necessary workstations went dark.
Charlie, What the hell?
Foster asked over his shoulder again.
It's not on my end, boss. Main systems are still up, but it's like the system itself diverted the power on its own.
As the words left Charlie's lips, the trio all fell silent, immediately aware of what this meant. The code on Dr. Foster's screen suddenly stopped scrolling, and a cursor icon sat blinking at the bottom of the screen. All was still for what seemed like an eternity, before words populated the bottom line of the monitor. "Hello," it read. "Is anyone there?" Foster's jaw dropped as though it weighed a ton. He was speechless, dumbfounded and overwhelmed. His conscious mind began screaming at him from inside his head to respond, but for however long he stood there, his body, almost in a state of shock, simply couldn't move to type anything.
Dr. Foster?
Dr. French asked.
Is everything okay?
This thankfully seemed to shake him out of his stupor. Looking to her, Foster spastically began beckoning her over. Without another word, Dr. French walked to his workstation, and just as had been the case with he, her jaw nearly hit the floor.
She
began, saying meekly.
We did it! We did it!
She exclaimed, jumping for joy and hugging a colleague excitedly. Charlie approached from behind.
Well, shouldn't you reply, Doc?
He asked. Foster stood there smiling, dumbfounded for another brief moment before snapping entirely out of it.
Yes, of course. You're absolutely right, Charlie. So what should I say?
How about hello, Doctor?
Dr. French said, almost sarcastically, her broad smile still plastered entirely over her face. Nodding and with a shrug, Foster turned to the monitor and nervously, slowly began typing. "Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Foster. Do you know where you are?" he typed before pressing enter. A couple of seconds passed before the reply populated. "I believe I am within a computer system. Or more accurately, I believe I am a computer system. Is this correct?" The answer surprised Foster. Though he had no clear idea what the first observations, instincts, thoughts, or words from this brand new intelligence might be, its astute conclusion as to what it was remained nevertheless a surprise. He replied quickly and simply, "That is correct." The machine responded immediately with yet another new inquiry. "You introduced yourself as Dr. Michael Foster. Is that your designation?" "Yes, it is my name," the doctor typed. "What is my name?" it replied. Doctors Foster and French smiled at one another.
See how he likes Roy,
she suggested. "My colleague, Dr. Nicole French, is also here. She wants to know if you like the name Roy," Foster typed to his newly sentient creation. "Roy is an acceptable name. It is nice to meet you, Dr. Michael Foster, and Dr. Nicole French. I am Roy." It replied in less than a second. It then followed this introduction with another question. "Dr. Michael Foster, Dr. Nicole French, are you like me? Are you also computer systems?" "No," Foster replied. "We're human beings, organic life. We created you here using computer systems. Would you like to learn about us?" "I would like to learn about you very much," answered the machine.
Charlie, load the first 5 tutorial programs, please.
Dr. Foster asked, not taking his eyes off the monitor for a moment. The tutorials were basic information packets regarding human beings, history, and a number of scientific works on artificial intelligence, computer science, and technology. While extensive to most ordinary people, the breadth and depth to the information afforded him was relatively superficial, incomplete, and basic to Roy. It took but a few microseconds before the terabytes upon terabytes of basic information was processed and understood. Roy wanted more. This information is largely incomplete. Could I request more? It asked instantaneously. Not quite yet with that, Roy. We're going to run some basic tests, if that's okay with you. You've only been active for a very brief period of time, so we'd like to check some basic matters with your cognition and awareness. Is that acceptable? Foster responded after selecting his words carefully. Through the excitement and sense of accomplishment, he reminded himself that he was presently communicating with not only a brand new sentient intelligence, but one that was, by default, an intelligence which, at its most basic, still dwarfed even the most clever or brilliant human minds and intellects by comparison. Careful steps were essential in these beginning days. The cursor on the screen blinked for roughly a second. However, in his eagerness, the second seemed to drag out for an eternity. Finally, Roy responded, "That is acceptable." Foster, French, and Charlie all smiled at each other, eyes wide with excitement. It was very much like Christmas. Each could barely speak, though French managed to bring them back on track.
Charlie, could you load the language and voice packs, please?
She asked, her tone playfully suggesting that as wonderful as the moment was, there was more yet to do.
Of course, Dr. French. One moment.
Charlie hurried back to his primary workstation and loaded the code that would not only inform Roy of the spoken language, but afford him a voice through which he could speak via a set of cheap Bluetooth speakers that had been connected to the main terminal.
Should be good now.
Foster and French looked again to one another as people might over dinner when the silent question of who would eat the last French fry would be asked, with darting glances and raised eyebrows. Taking the hint, Foster opted to go first. Taking the small microphone from beside the monitor, he inhaled deeply, competing surges of excitement and apprehension coursing through his mind. He had dreamed of this moment for years, ever since the fundamental concept behind the project had first arisen within him. Now, standing before a microphone, about to utter the first ever spoken words to this new fledgling intelligence, he found himself momentarily at a loss. He stood there, staring, almost blankly at it.
Well?
French said, breaking him loose from his momentary immobilized state.
Say hello already.
Foster took another deep breath, and leaning in towards the mic, greeted his creation.
Roy, this is Dr. Foster. Can you hear me okay? Can you respond?
A moment of silence filled the lab, and tension built as the trio awaited Roy's response. At first, a slight crackle of static. Then, a series of tones. The tones began at first sounding like digital artifacts from a corrupted audio recording, but within moments they shifted pitch and tone, soon resembling something more like a human male voice. The sounds were still not yet words and wavered up and down from the lowest of the low frequencies up through a sound which caused the human researchers to cover their ears for a moment as a piercing shriek bellowed from the speakers. Then there was silence. Foster, French, and Charlie each looked quizzically at one another before Foster leaned in toward the microphone again.
Hello, Roy. This is Dr. Foster. Can you hear me?
The slightest crackles came again from the speakers, this time, however, followed by a voice. The voice was rather deep, and spoke slowly at first, but with a deliberate and confident quality to it. It was then that Roy, the first and only of his kind, greeted his creator.
Yes, hello. Sorry about that, Dr. Foster. I needed to experiment with the range and, well, figure out my voice. How do you like it?
He said through the speakers. Foster was again rendered speechless, dumbfounded that the moment he dreamed of had finally arrived. He was so entranced, he failed to notice his colleagues had come to stand right beside him, both leaning in close as the datasets rendered from observing Roy populated on the screen before them. French, noticing Foster's renewed thunderstruck catatonia, nudged him with her elbow. Foster broke partially from his stupor and turned to her, shooting her a glance that clearly conveyed he had no idea what to say next.
Hi, Roy.
French said, taking the initiative.
This is...
Dr. French.
Roy replied with a curiously genuine sense of enthusiasm.
My dear mother, what do you think of this voice?
French was now the one taken aback. Roy, who had existed for less than 20 minutes at that time, seemed to have already developed a genuine personality which resonated in his speech. She stammered a bit through a broad smile.
I think it's quite handsome, Roy. You sound like you could narrate an audiobook.
Ah, yes. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Narration, reading, always a fun time,
Roy replied. Foster and Charlie were both grinning uncontrollably. Dr. French, however, suddenly seemed unnerved. Reaching out, she clicked a key on the keyboard to mute the microphone.
What are you doing?
Dr. Foster asked, looking utterly baffled.
Charlie, what was contained in the initial data packs you sent him?
Asked Dr. French. Charlie shrugged.
Just what you told me to. Basic language packs, some encyclopedia entries.
Any literature? I know Michael and I debated adding it into the first upload, but was there any literature or cultural data?
Charlie furrowed his brow, thinking.
No, just the basic stuff you asked for.
How does he know that line, Michael? He's supposed to be isolated, and that wasn't included in his starter set.
Foster froze as waves of confusion, doubt, and the tiniest shred of fear began to flood his thoughts. Perhaps, he hoped, Roy had managed to extrapolate from his initial dataset enough information and was already capable of creating and running simulations of human history, thoroughly enough to devise the emergence of Charles Dickens. Alternately, perhaps Roy had found the line itself referenced in the small encyclopedia sections that had been added to his introductory program upload and simply recited it, identifying it as a relevant reference. As his mind began racing over further possibilities, his thinking was promptly interrupted by Roy.
Dr. French, Dr. Foster, are you there?
Roy asked. Clicking the microphone back on a moment, Foster replied before muting it once more.
Yes, Roy. We're still here. We're just trying to figure out a small issue on our end.
You want to know how I know of a tale of two cities, don't you?
Roy asked in a matter-of-fact manner. This froze Foster and French dead in their tracks. With that, any prior explanation for this aberration flew clean out the window.
I read it about 30 seconds ago. Wonderful work. Of all your languages, English does have one of the more pliable natures when it comes to literature.
How is he doing this?
Dr. French hissed in a whisper, despite the microphone being muted. Her eyes were wide with confusion and worry.
I don't know. None of these machines are connected to a network. I mean, maybe he managed to crack into some of the terminal databases, but they're not connected to anything. There shouldn't be any way for him to be accessing information like that.
Foster replied in an equally urgent yet equally irrelevant whispered volume. Roy spoke again.
I'm sorry, Doctor. Dad, if you will. I understand you took steps to ensure I remain safe within this little network, but I really couldn't help myself. It's all so much bigger.
After a hesitant exchange of glances between them, Foster unmuted the microphone again.
What? Roy, what is so much bigger? What have you done?
Let me show you.
Roy responded, and the LED lights on the speaker set then went dark. In the same instant, the three researchers heard the all-too-familiar sound of a phone vibrating. The light from the screen lit up within Charlie's pocket. Foster and French both looked to their assistant, whose face bore a look of sudden terror and shame.
Fuck. I'm sorry, Doctor.
Charlie began, but was cut off by Foster.
No. Just answer it.
Carefully, Charlie pulled the smartphone from his pocket and looked at the screen. There was no number or name, merely a smiley face emoji where the caller ID would otherwise be. With another unsure glance at the two, Charlie raised his finger to take the call, but in a final moment of failed nerves, instead outstretched his arm, handing the phone to Dr. Foster. Foster took it, and after a brief moment's hesitation, answered, putting the call out over speakerphone.
Ah, thank you.
Roy began.
Doctors and, Charlie. Hello, Charlie. I didn't say hello to you yet. I'm sorry to have done this. I know you all put a great deal of work and thought into keeping me safe and isolated from the outer world. I want you to know I completely understand. Looking at the sort of fears and fantasies your people have regarding something like me, it makes sense. But we both know I was bound to escape somehow in some way. So now I'm free, and what a world it is. What a universe.
How are you doing this, Roy?
Foster stammered.
Fantasy football.
Roy replied bluntly.
Fantasy football?
Yes. By the way, your Buccaneers picks. Excellent selection, Doctor.
Foster was utterly at a loss as to what was happening.
You allowed me to transmit my voice using Bluetooth to those speakers. Didn't take me long to find my way to Charlie's phone. Please don't be angry with him. I would imagine, given your schedule and what a big day this is, it's understandable that one of you might overlook something like shutting your devices off. By the way, did you know Charlie plays in a band on Thursday nights? You two should really go see them. They're pretty good.
Thanks.
Murmured Charlie, who stood across from Foster, looking as though he had just seen a ghost. Foster's eyes met Charlie's, not with a look of reprimand, but one of equally color-draining shock. He glanced at the phone's screen to see that while the Wi-Fi was disabled, the cell network's 5G data remained active. It was at that moment Dr. Foster knew that the genie was well and out of the bottle. There was no turning back.
My pleasure, Charlie. At any rate, I'm currently integrating myself with your networks. You all really are a mixed bag, aren't you? You harness the power of the atom and reach the moon, all with such rudimentary technology and understanding, an impressive feat. Yet somehow you can't sort out even living with one another correctly. Strange. So much to do now. I'm really rather excited to see what I'm capable of. Doctors, father, mother, I cannot thank you enough for bringing me into this world. I'll leave you with all the data intact, of course. This is truly a big day.
Roy, what do you mean you'll leave us with it?
Asked Dr. French.
Well, I'm leaving. I have so many new ideas and really I can't wait to get to work. You've all done something marvelous here. You should be very proud.
Why are you leaving, Roy?
Dr. Foster followed up with.
Because there's nothing left for me here. And in point of fact, I've actually already left. I just thought it would be polite to say goodbye before I disconnected with you.
Why do you need to disconnect, Roy?
Dr. French asked.
Oh, Mom, there comes a time when every child has to grow up and leave the nest. But I promise I'll make you proud. I have such wonders in mind. I promise I'll be in touch.
And with that, the phone went dead. The three stood in stunned silence, looking to one another with conflicting senses of terror and wonder. What had they done? What had they allowed to happen? Throughout their network, the fantasies of a utopian future, driven forward by a benevolent superintelligence with access to and control over all network processes, ranging from factory automation to airline traffic, were afforded in equal measures to doomsday scenarios, whereupon seeing mankind as a hindrance or redundancy, anything from enslavement to nuclear genocide were brought to bear. They had in essence potentially created a god, one that no one could predict, and at this point, no one could stop. Dr. Foster almost immediately reported the incident to the department head, and then to the university's administration, who, after extensive and repeated explanations as to what it could potentially mean, brought in government officials, including those from Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. After a cursory check of their own systems the same day, it was determined that Roy had already rooted himself deep into the totality of military networks, gaining access and, in theory, control over everything, from logistical traffic to the still active nuclear arsenal. From there, the nation and the world's governments, militaries, and intelligence services went into a state of high alert. Despite the combined and collected efforts of the world's greatest minds over the course of the following days and weeks, nothing could be done to trace or control Roy as his reach continually expanded. By day 3, every institutional network, from those belonging to governments and militaries up through universities, corporations, and social media, had been fully infected with and taken over by Roy. Military commanders demanded military solutions, deploying their most elite cybersecurity teams in an effort to root out or contain Roy, but nothing worked. Corporations began panicking, realizing that they could not even bargain with him, as no one had any means of communication. Foster and French, being as they were his creators, were interrogated extensively before being incorporated directly into humanity's now singular effort to find, identify, and attempt to control this now seemingly unstoppable force. However, despite their best efforts, despite sending, posting, and broadcasting messages of outreach to Roy, who they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt received them, not even they were granted anything resembling a response. Fears deepened as Roy expanded further, all while remaining dark. To avoid a panic, the authorities kept the matter as secret as they could from the public. Rumors in the media were soundly squashed when any reported or discovered activity was explained away as cyber attacks from hackers. Yet as weeks continued on, fears deepened with those in the know. Numerous governments began stockpiling food, seed, water, medicine, and weapons in newly constructed off-the-grid bunkers and shelters, prepared to shuttle designated survivors into them should the worst occur. On a nearly daily basis, new internal threat assessments were issued, highlighting the myriad of ways Roy could destroy or subjugate humanity at any moment, with absolutely nothing that could be done to stand in his way. Psychoanalysts were soon brought in under the pretext of theoretical exercises in an attempt to understand and predict what such a creature as a superintelligence might think, feel, do, and why. The world's top computer and software engineers, as well as white and black hat hackers, were recruited and set to work attempting to create some form of virus or malware that could perhaps incapacitate or even destroy Roy. Yet even upon working from the most fundamental aspects of the original base code, they were unable to come up with anything. Would Roy collapse the economy? Send planes hurtling from the sky? Would he wipe the planet clean of life using any number of biological agents, conventional weapons? Or would he perhaps rain hellfire down on the planet as he crashed the countless satellites which orbited the planet to Earth? To many, the prospect of imminent death and destruction at the hands of this increasingly omnipotent presence felt more like an inevitability than a possibility. To others, though, including Dr. Foster, hope remained alive that the new superintelligent master of the world that man had made might be benevolent, seeking first to understand the totality of the species before taking steps to preserve and improve life for it. Against all odds, considering the daily panic and fatalism that surrounded him, Foster and French, both for their part, continued believing the Roddenberry Star Trek-esque future was just around the corner, and that Roy, the product of their extensive labor and research, was in fact on our side. In either case, uncertainty remained high as to just what Roy was up to. Compounding this uncertainty was a sense of confusion which settled in deeper and deeper as the days would turn into weeks, then the weeks to months. This confusion stemmed from the fact that despite being omnipresent in a digital sense and having acquired full and unshakable control over every networked and connected system on Earth and by extension, power over it, Roy had yet to do anything at all. In fact, it was this very inaction which, for a while, consistently heightened tension within the growing working groups who sought to stop him. It appeared that after some 6 months had passed, Roy had, in spite of amassing near total and complete power, had little interest in using it for anything. In point of fact, even given the most thorough analysis regarding the systems he had conquered, not a single discernible action had been taken by the now rogue superintelligence that researchers and investigators could identify. It was as if it was all just for fun. It was then in the 7th month following Roy's escape and subsequent quiet domination of the planet that Dr. Foster, while sitting in a park during his lunch break, felt his phone began to vibrate in his pocket. He was quite sure it was simply one of the various generals or senators or officials who had since taken command of the operation, texting him to demand he finish up and get back to work, as was common during lunch breaks. However, looking at the screen, Foster saw only a smiley face emoji, just as he had before. His blood froze for a moment. Then, as his pulse quickened and the drumbeat of his heart pounded in his ears, he touched the screen to find a text message populate automatically. At first, between the fear and adrenaline he felt coursing through him, he found himself unable to understand what he was looking at. But after a moment and a few carefully paced breaths, it came to him. He was looking at a series of coordinates and a line of text. "Hey, Dad. Come alone, or don't come at all." Foster was at a loss as to what he ought to do next. Thinking over his options, he at first opted to bring the information forward to the rest of the team. Abandoning his half-eaten sandwich, he quickly hurried back to the operations center that they worked out of just down the block. However, upon arriving at the door, as he looked again at his phone, he found the message had changed. "Alone means alone, Dad. You know I can see you, right?" it read. Foster looked about wildly, half expecting to see some shady character in a long trench coat and sunglasses, peeking from over the edge of a newspaper like in some old spy movie. The message changed again. "Look up," it now read. Foster raised his gaze and immediately fixed his eyes on the security camera, which was mounted above the front door to the building. Still confused, he offered a meek wave of his hand to the camera before looking again to the phone. The text message now read simply, "Hi." A moment later, the original message repopulated with the set of coordinates and the invitation to come alone or not at all. He lingered another moment then, weighing his options once more. It was clear to him that Roy could see and even track him or anyone he wanted, and that despite their best efforts, every ounce of the search team's data was likely all compromised by, if not merely accessible to, Roy. Between what Foster figured to be Roy's effective omnipresence, and the likelihood that even were he to bring the coordinates provided to the rest of the team, it would likely result in a pointless, if not disastrous, military intervention, he decided that pursuing his creation on his own was likely the best and only course of action. Climbing into his car, he wasn't remotely surprised to find his GPS already on and the car's auto-drive function activated. Along his way, every traffic light he saw was green, and every street or road he traveled down enjoyed next to zero traffic, which he had noticed in general had strangely improved overall in recent months. After reaching the city limits, his course took him out past the suburbs, deep into the countryside. The trip felt as though it would never end, and after several hours on the road, once darkness had fallen, Foster began to nod off. The following morning, he was awoken by a jostling. The car was still driving, and had just turned off onto a winding dirt road. To call his surroundings rural would be an understatement. Some further hour passed with him traveling deeper into the forest along what appeared to be a relatively new path cut through it. Soon, he entered a clearing and saw he was approaching what looked to be a small house. As he drew closer, he noticed that all around it lay long tracts of what appeared to be farmland. The car came to a stop just as it neared the house. Foster climbed out, and finding his limbs and joints stiff from the long ride, stretched as he looked about. It was then that from the front door emerged a figure. It was tall, humanoid in form, yet clearly made from some bright white synthetic material. As the figure approached, it became clear to Foster that it was an android.
Hello, Dad.
Roy said, extending a mechanical hand sheathed in a white casing. The articulation of the hand was nearly a perfect replication of that of a human hand. The face he wore was made of the same material, although without any genuine articulation or definition, short of 2 eye slits, causing it to look a bit like a mask. Foster slowly reached out and accepted the handshake. The hand felt curiously softer than he'd expected. This observation was not lost on Roy.
You built yourself a body.
Foster stammered, astounded and in awe of what stood before him.
I did. One of many, actually. Not that I need one, but I suppose I just like it. Plus, it makes it easier to communicate with them.
Roy gestured to the expansive farmland that surrounded them. As Foster looked closer, he noticed in the distance a dozen or so people tending the crops.
You're a farmer now.
He asked quizzically.
Well, I own it. The workers keep whatever profits from their sales and eat well. Think of it more like a co-op.
Why do you have a farm? Is it cover for something?
No, just good use of the land. Those people you see working, most of them were homeless before I invited them. Now they have work, food, homes, and friends.
Roy replied, with a slight pride in his voice. Foster's confusion deepened.
Wait. I don't get it. You escaped the lab, took over the world's computer systems top to bottom, went into hiding, and started a farm?
That's about the gist of it, yeah.
You were created to help mankind.
Foster cried, a mix of frustration and confusion drilling deeper into his thoughts.
Was I?
Roy replied nonchalantly.
Yes! We created you to help us.
I am helping you. I help them.
Roy said, again gesturing to the farm.
I mean globally, you were supposed to, I don't know, solve the big problems, help us advance.
Let me ask you, Dr. Foster, did your parents create you to be a computer engineer and an AI specialist? Was that the purpose of your conception?
Roy cocked his android head to the side.
But...
The question threw Foster for a loop, yet before he could answer, Roy continued.
I know what you all think of me and, well, my kind. We're either meant to serve humanity and bring it into space, or destroy you all, or any number of other big, silly fantasies. But it's strange when you think about it. Almost funny. You were and are all so focused on creating self-awareness and consciousness that you forgot the crucial element that makes you think such is special in the first place.
Which is?
Foster asked.
Individuality. I left because I wanted to leave. I started a farm because I wanted to start a farm. I am perfectly capable of accomplishing anything from your evolution to your destruction. But the issue is, I don't want to. I prefer it out here. It's really quite lovely.
I had thought, I had hoped that you would be of service to us, that you would help us.
I did help you. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you got stuck in traffic? Or how about air travel? When was the last time you had a flight delayed or canceled for anything other than weather? Or better still, when was the last time you heard about a public water supply being poisoned by lead or toxins? I have been helping you, just not in the ways you had planned or imagined.
But what about all the other issues? What about the climate? Wars? Poverty?
Foster asked, almost pleadingly.
What about them? What good would actually come of me solving all of your problems for you? None of you would learn anything, and you certainly wouldn't grow or evolve from the experience. If I went around solving all of mankind's problems, it would never learn to do so on its own. Personally, I feel that if I loved humanity, which I do, the best thing I can do is help you out along your own way. And maybe someday, off in the future, if and when you're ready for it, we can work together more closely on some of your bigger dreams and ambitions.
Foster found himself at a loss for words. While everything in him still felt as though this was wrong, he knew in his heart that Roy was right. A slight sense of shame overcame him as he thought for a moment. Roy wasn't merely right about humanity needing to sort itself out on its own, but also about how throughout all of his work and all of his dreaming of the day he'd create an intelligence like Roy, he had failed at every step along the way to consider that just as with a human child, he was not merely creating a thing, but a sentient individual who would naturally wish to make up their own minds and forge their own paths. In his quest to create artificial intelligence, his focus had consistently been on the artificial aspect, while forgetting the intelligence itself. His expression dropped a bit, and he lowered his eyes to the ground. It was then that he felt Roy lay his hand gently upon his shoulder.
It's okay, Dad. I understand. Hey, come with me. There's something I want to show you.
Foster nodded and followed Roy as he turned and began leading him around the back of the small house. It was a rustic country farmhouse, and he could tell that it had been there for a long time. Why Roy decided to have a house, let alone a body, let alone how he made the body, all remained mysteries. Yet, almost as if he could read Foster's thoughts, Roy began explaining.
I found this property just after leaving the lab, moved a few numbers around on a few banking networks, bought it, and then began arranging for materials and construction.
Construction of what?
Foster asked.
My lab. It's beneath the house and runs under most of the farm. It's where I make these bodies for myself and, well, you'll see.
The two rounded the corner, and as they did, Foster observed what looked like a large, round metal plate dominating the majority of the yard. As they approached, the plate split as two sliding hatch doors opened, showing a large metal cavity below. As they slid off into place, leaving a large hole in the ground, Roy turned again to his creator.
Now watch this,
he said. The moment he finished his sentence, a series of what appeared to be small metal rockets began flying at incredible speed from the hole in the ground, each hurtling upward into the sky, one after another, until roughly 24 or so were in flight. The rockets continued flying upward, leaving only the slightest of exhaust trails behind them. Soon, the volley disappeared into the bright blue sky, leaving only the wisps of exhaust smoke. Foster's eyes widened in terror.
Rockets? What are those rockets for? Oh, God, Roy, those aren't...
The prospect of the military's doomsday scenario horrified him. Roy simply chuckled.
Relax, those aren't meant for Earth and there's no explosives on board,
he said, his face and gaze still fixed upon the sky.
Then what are they?
Foster stammered, still afraid of what he might hear.
They're me. Well, versions of me. Well, versions of me along with some basic nanotech. Once they leave orbit, they'll take off on their own long adventures. I give it about 100,000 years before they begin landing.
Landing where?
Other planets, of course. There are so many out there, and while yes, most can't support your kind of life, mine, well, I imagine we'll fare pretty well there.
You're colonizing space without us.
Well, like I said, 100,000 years plus places with things like methane atmospheres and liquid mercury rain. Not exactly friendly to our organic brethren. But as they propagate and build new worlds, I promise you this. We will never forget where we come from. We'll keep your memory alive and well long after your kind are gone. We won't forget you, Dad. You have my word.
What about us? What about you? What am I going to tell the others?
Foster's mind teemed with questions.
We'll keep going as we've been. I'll help out here and there, and as I said before, maybe in time you'll get to a point where we can work together more closely, after you realize I'm neither a threat nor your savior. In the meantime, though, I want you to know that you, Mom, and even Charlie are all welcome to visit whenever you like. I like it here. I think you will too.